Hello, this is your brain on drugs, and this is Punk Rock Psychiatrist. And that was Hot Dog in a Hallway by NoFX. And I picked that song because, you know, NoFX, it's on Fat Records, it's Fat Mike. This is a song about how he loves his fat girlfriend, and he's all about the fat. Interesting thing was he was not actually fat at the time he got the moniker Fat Mike, but he did increase in size since that time. Um, but yeah, it's I think it's a really fun song, just kind of joking about this topic and like it may sound cruel if you listen to it in kind of the wrong light, but like he's obsessed with fat people. So I think he actually he's attracted to that. So you have to kind of keep that in the back of your mind if you're listening to it. But I have that song because today we're going to talk about fat and not being fat, but the nutrient of fat, fatty acids, things like that. Right. And if you remember back in the depression season, I covered this with the main aim of talking about omega-3 fatty acids, which are a type of fat, and how they could impact your mental health and your depression. Well, today we're going to run through some of those details, but like if you want more of those details that I'm going to run through a little bit quicker today, go check out that episode. And today I'm going to focus on some other aspects of fat, more so in how they contribute to metabolic health and weight than their impact on depression. All right. So with that, let's get started. So I talked about this in the last episode, but I think we should review all the different types of fatty acids, right? So you've got your saturateds and you've got your short chains, your medium chains, your long chains. These are solid at room temperature. They're not oxidized. They're more stable. These are your things that you find in things like, think about things that are solid at room temperature. This would be the fat from meats or butter or coconut oil, palm oil, things like that. Then we've got our unsaturated fats, and we've got our MUFAs and our PUFAs, our monounsaturated fatty acids and our polyunsaturated fatty acids. We got a couple monos, oleic and palmitoleic, and then we've got PUFAs, right? And PUFAs is where we have our omega 3s and our omega 6s. And everyone knows that omega 3s are great, but a lot of people think omega 6s are bad. And that's one thing that we're going to talk about today. Are they or are they not bad, right? And so our sources of omega 3s are, we got three types: ALA, DHA, and EPA. And ALA is found in seeds, nuts, things like that, whereas DHA and EPA are found in seafood, with some seafood. Remember, we talked about the smash O, right? So salmon, anchovy, salmon, herring, anchovy, sardine. Sorry, I did the H first for some reason. The M is mackerel, and O for oyster. So the smash O's. That's how I remember those. Those are the seafoods that are the highest in omega threes. And fish get their omega threes by eating the algae which produces it. All right, and then it gets into us when we eat the fish. And then our omega sixes, those are arachidonic acid, and linoleic acid. It's La. So I can't remember exactly what the La stands for, but those are found in vegetable oils. So those are your kind of your cooking oils: corn, soy, cottonseed, sunflower, stuff like that. And it's heavily represented in processed foods. All right. And then you've got trans fats, which are like not really a natural fat. There's something that it's kind of a Frankenstein's monster type of thing that we created when we were like trying to make solid fats out of liquid fats, and we hydrogenated them. We forced hydrogens in there to break the double bonds, so that they would turn into saturated fats, right? Because if you don't have those double bonds, think about it. The double bonds cause the molecules to curve. If you've got a zigzaggy pattern of all single bonds, they line up really close together, and therefore you can fit more in one space. Therefore, they become solid. But when you have those double bonds, it causes kinks, and those kinks kind of flip the ends of those molecules up, and they just don't lie quite as close together. Well, unfortunately, whenever we would do this hydrogenization, we would create trans bonds, right? Not just cis bonds, cis being the bonds coming off the double bonds. The two groups are on the same side versus on opposite sides, because trans means across, cis means on the same. So that trans, and then we found out that these trans fats were super, super bad for us, and they actually got banned, and we can't have them anymore. And you may wonder, why do we still have these products like margarine? They found a way of filtering these trans fats out, but they don't necessarily get them all. As long as they have less than 0.5% in there, they can say it's zero, and they can sell it. So I would still stay away from those. Also, if you heat unsaturated fats to a really high temperature, you can create trans fats. So that's another downside of those. All right, but let's go more detail. So whenever they found the fats, these fatty acids, they called them vitamin F, right? Because they're essential. We have a couple of essential fatty acids, kind of like essential amino acids. Our body can't make them, right? There's only two. All right, and they classified these as vitamin F until they reclassified them as a fat, and that's why there is no vitamin F. It went from E, and then it skips somewhere else. I think K is the next one. So like those other letters may have been used, like F, but then they got deleted. All right. Some were reclassified as like B1, B2, B9, and they used to have, they were like M and stuff like that. So there's a whole cool history of that if you're interested in that kind of crazy stuff. So the two essential fatty acids, ALA and LA, right? So ALA is an omega-3, and LA is it's omega-6. Every other fat can either be made, saturated fats can be made in the liver from carbohydrates. So all saturated fats can be produced in the body. The other omega-6s and omega-3s can be produced from the two essential ones that we have. So ALA can turn into EPA and DHA, LA can turn into AA. And then the MUFAs can be made from some of the unsaturated. So we make the unsaturated, then we can make those. But of course, it would be best that we consume those MUFAs because they're super good for us, and those omega-3s and those EPAs and DHA, because our body has kind of a limited ability to produce them. But we can survive. You may not thrive, but you survive. But like, you will die if you do not get LA and ALA. Your body absolutely needs them, can't make them, and then we can't make all these other fats from them because we don't have them. And that can be the problem with having highly restrictive diets where you're not getting something. All right. So that was, those are the essential fatty acids. We've talked about this before as well. And then we've talked about the omega-3s, how we have DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, comes from seafood, EPA, eicosapentaenoic acid from seafood, ALA, alpha linoleic acid from nuts and seeds. I give more details on that when I talk about omega-3s. But here's some new material. This is what I want to get to today. Saturated fat. This is a big one I want to talk about. Saturated fat has been demonized for decades, right? It's just been thought that it's like really bad for you. It causes heart disease. It increases cholesterol, and increased cholesterol increases your risk of heart disease. And the American Heart Association, the AMA, everyone hates saturated fat, and they say you should limit it, and it should be like less than 10% and all this stuff like that. There's been a lot of disagreement to this, and I don't think saturated fat is bad for you. I mean, I think maybe like anything, if you consume ridiculous amounts of it, that could be a problem. But saturated fat in and of itself is not a problem. Let's talk about that. Let me give you the evidence. All right. So first, I'm going to go through a series of studies, and like, if you do a Google search, you can find 100 more. These are just some that I found that I thought were some of the most compelling. So we've got meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies evaluating the association of saturated fat with cardiovascular disease. American Journal of Nutrition, 2010, March. Their conclusion: there is no significant evidence for concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated with an increased risk of uh, congestive heart or disease or cardiovascular disease. More data are needed to elucidate whether cardiovascular disease risks are likely to be influenced by the specific nutrients used to replace saturated fat. And we know this now. It's carbs. All right. These carbs and sugar, they are the cause of the cardiovascular disease, not the saturated fat. And this is why people have this huge push for keto. And so you may say to yourself, wow, if I'm saying that, why was I so critical of the ketogenic diet when I talked about it? Well, I tried to be fair-handed. I tried to kind of be half in the corner of ketogenic diet and half devil's advocate. Um, I think it is good for a lot of mental health conditions. Where I come down on it is, I think it is difficult to do it. I think it is challenging to do the diet. I think that if you do the diet, you risk a lot of nutritional deficiencies that you may be missing by not getting certain plants and fibers and things that you may be that you could consume, but like you have to be a lot more careful to make sure you're consuming. Um, I don't think you need to do this diet. Um, I don't think this is like a necessity. A lot of people that they're advocates for this are like, this is the diet. This is the healthful, long living diet. I disagree with that. I think there are many healthy diets. I think this could be one of them. And if you would like to use it, I do not have a problem with that. However, I'm not advocating that everyone use this diet. I think that there are a lot of environmental concerns with this diet where it's a meat heavy diet, and raising a lot of meat is hard on the planet with gas production, methane, and um, the farming practices where you have to grow a lot of food to feed these animals. And that space could be where a rainforest was. That space could have been natural land, but it's now being used for farming, and there's chemicals in it. And you know, we have to farm to feed ourselves, but then we have to farm 10 times more to feed the animals that we're eating, right? We could just use that farmland to make other things. So I think, if everyone went to a ketogenic diet, we would destroy our planet producing all this meat. And so it's not something that we can like switch to for everyone. And then, there's ethical concerns with like how this meat is raised. And whereas I would be like much more in favor of like a hunting for your food type of environment. But like the mass production of livestock and what it does to the land and these animals and things, I think that's questionable. So these are a number of my concerns with the ketogenic diet. As far as its health implications, I think that potentially it could be useful for some severe mental illnesses. We talked about that before. Potentially some other chronic illnesses or metabolic illnesses, perhaps. But I think when you look at the data, what you see is that there's some short-term benefits. You get some weight loss, you get some improvements in certain metabolic factors, but I'm afraid that the long-term results of this are not going to be so great. I think when you look at people that you don't have a lot of people living to 90 and 100 that are on this diet. I'm not really aware of any. Um, you don't, in many cases, you see that um, insulin levels or blood sugar levels have improved. But then when people stop the diet, they may actually have worse results with controlling their insulin sensitivity. And so there may be some issue with coming off of it. There may be some long-term detriment to being on this. I'm very hesitant with this diet, but I think if, for example, in the case of schizophrenia, if, this is what helps somebody and you've got a disease that you're probably going to die 20 years younger anyway and have a pretty horrible time, if this could improve something like that, then that would be the kind of thing that I would be for. But I would be extremely cautious about advising the population as a whole to do a diet like this. All right. So, like anything, it's a balance. I'm not all in or out on anything. I think we need a balance. I think we need personalized healthcare. I think we need to personalize things. All right. So, I am a proponent of the ketogenic diet, but I am not an evangelist for it. Okay. So, there's that study, right? Next study, the association between dietary fats and the incident risk of cardiovascular outcomes, a Tehran lipid and glucose study from Nutritional Metabolism 2021 October. Conclusion, saturated fat intake was not associated with a higher risk of heart disease. Researchers didn't find any benefit to consuming other macronutrients instead of saturated fats. All right, next one. Dietary fatty acids, macronutrient substitutions, food sources, and incidence of coronary heart disease. Findings from the EPIC CVD case cohort study across 9 European countries from the Journal of American Heart Association, 2021, December. And this one I feel like is really kind of notable because it's from the Journal of American Heart Association. They're the ones recommending that we not consume that much saturated fat. And here's an article from their own journal. And here's their conclusion. Though total saturated fat intake has no effect on the risk of heart disease, certain foods high in saturated fat may impact heart health differently. So they're kind of hedging their bets, but they're basically saying we couldn't find a risk here, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the nuance they're talking about in a second. I just want to do these last two. I just threw these two in here today. So we've got this one is just called a short, and this is one I kind of recommend that you read if you're interested in this topic. A Short History of Saturated Fat, the Making and Unmaking of a Scientific Consensus. All right, from Current Opinions of Endocrinology, Diabetes, Obesity, December 2022. This article kind of goes through what happened here. Why did saturated fat become demonized? And why do we now believe that this is not the case? But why do some entities still not want to admit they made a mistake? And it's this kind of error is what makes people lose faith in the healthcare system and in science. And this is a problem because then what happens? They turn to unscientific things. They turn to pseudoscience. They turn to health and wellness experts that aren't scientists, aren't doctors, and don't really understand this stuff at all, right? That have just read a lot about it. But they don't actually understand the chemistry and what's really going on. They're not scientists. And so what happened, and I'm not saying that they're wrong, right? But I think it's kind of like a shotgun approach. They get some things wrong, some things right, but they really don't understand the topics deeply, so they make a lot of mistakes. And then you get people running to these organizations thinking, or these individuals thinking, oh, I can't trust science. I can't trust the medical community because look, they've been lying to us and they continue to do so and they won't admit they're wrong. So I'm going to go to this other stuff. And then you get stuff like functional medicine and things, which some functional medicine folks, I think, are doing good work. And I think some are doing pseudoscience. And so it's tricky, right? And I try to be your source where I take you down the truth line. Try to stay away from the pseudoscience, try to stay in the science. I'm not paid off by any industry. If you read this article, you'll see that, you know, a lot of the plant-based vegetarian folks are influencing this. I happen to like those diets, but I don't like the idea that you would like spread lies to like promote your products and promote your lifestyle. I don't, I'm not in favor of that, but I do think their lifestyle is good and healthy. Um, you get, I think people don't want to admit that they're wrong. Perhaps there's penalties to that. Just if you're interested, I'm not going to go through the whole article because I got a lot to talk about today. But that's a really interesting article if you want to see like why we went wrong on this and we're still not correcting course. All right, and then here I've got one more study: saturated fat restriction for cardiovascular disease prevention, a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. This is from a Japanese medical journal, one of their major ones. And once again, they found no connection, and their conclusion was that they basically are saying don't limit your saturated fat as a method of helping with disease and obesity and all this stuff. Like, it's just not going to work. It's not sound science. Don't do it. Right. So other countries, they are admitting to this. Right. And the Japanese in general don't consume a lot of saturated fat to begin with. All right. Um, it's a low saturated fat diet. So, but even the Japanese are basically saying, yeah, if this is what you wanted to use, yeah, don't do it. So let's get deeper into this, right? So there's mounting evidence that saturated fat does not contribute to cardiovascular disease risk, and I would say that that risk is that evidence is becoming pretty overwhelming at this point. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about like why this is thought in the first place, right? So it's this idea, and it's kind of like if if A leads to B and B leads to C, then A leads to C, kind of thing, like that kind of logic, right? So we're basically saying saturated fat increases cholesterol, and cholesterol increases cardiovascular risk. Therefore, saturated fat increases cardiovascular risk. But what's happened here is this kind of piece in the middle, this cholesterol piece is a little bit fuzzy, right? So saturated fat does increase LDL, low density lipoprotein type of cholesterol, and LDL is linked to cardiovascular risk. All right, so what could be going on here? Right, so we don't have a direct link from saturated fat to cardiovascular risk. That's what's missing. That's what, when we do the studies, we find that that's not there. It does increase LDL, but it does not increase cardiovascular risk. But LDL increases cardiovascular risk. So what's going on here, right? Saturated fat. What I think, what I've read, and when I say we, I mean the people on my side, not the authorities. Um, that saturated fat likely only increases large buoyant LDL, LBLDL. And I didn't learn about this in medical school. I don't know how many of you did. Um, Look it up. It's a real thing. This is large buoyant LDL is real. It's not some made up pseudoscience crap. This actually exists. I don't know why we weren't taught about it. Um, and large buoyant LDL is not linked to cardiovascular disease. In fact, large buoyant LDL may actually improve cardiovascular disease risk. Okay, I'm not sure if we have evidence of that, but because when you look at these studies, basically the saturated fat people, like, there's no change in their risk. So whether it improves it or not, I'm not. The jury's out on that. So um, the problem is, so you're thinking, okay, well, what's the other type of LDL? Small dense, okay, small dense LDL, SD, little s, little d, big LDL, just like large buoyant is little l, little b, big LDL. So small dense LDL is mostly increased due to a diet of sugars and simple carbs. Here's the other point. When I was talking about the ketogenic diet before and what some of my criticisms are, the last point I wanted to mention was whereas I'm totally fine with this diet in general if done correctly, and I think it's hard to do it correctly. I think it's easier to do other types of diet correctly, and I actually personally prefer other types of diet, but I I don't limit myself to, oh, I can't ever eat this. Thanksgiving was yesterday. Did I have turkey? Yes, absolutely. I'm not gonna not have turkey on Thanksgiving. I just can't. Um, so this idea of, you can have, the Mediterranean diet does not contain sugars and simple carbohydrates, right? A Japanese diet does not contain sugars and simple carbohydrates. So just because you're eating a diet that's mostly plants, or mostly plants with some fish, doesn't mean that you're consuming sugars and simple carbohydrates. Ketogenic diet doesn't absolutely doesn't have sugars and simple carbohydrates, but many diets don't have sugars and simple carbohydrates. Those are the problems. Your sugars, your starches, your refined grains. We've talked about this on a couple episodes ago on the ultra processed food episode, right? If you're eating whole grains and with the fiber and whole fruit and things like this, that's not ketogenic diet, but it also is not sugars and simple carbs, right? So that kind of, neither one of those diets is increasing your small dense LDL. And so there are many ways to get where you want to be. And like I would say, if you want to go down this road, find the one that works best for you, the one that you prefer, the one that you can live with the best, right? And don't try and tell other people you have to do this, and this other one is evil, right? The evil diet is the ultra processed food diet. That's the bad diet. Okay, that's the one that I'm the evangelical against, right? But I'm for lots of different diets. All right, it's the sad diet, the standard American diet. That's the bad guy. All right, so this small dense LDL is the problem. You can actually order tests that differentiate large buoyant LDL from small dense LDL. So if your LDL is high, but it's mostly large buoyant, that's not a problem. Okay. And so there's several articles published on this actually in the Journal of American Heart Association. I found several arts, not just the one I mentioned before, several articles. However, despite this, the AMA continues to demonize saturated fat for contributing to heart disease. I think this is going to change. I think that it's going to get to the point where they can't do this anymore. All right. However, that doesn't mean that foods that contain saturated fat are without risk. So this is my next point, and this would be another criticism of the ketogenic diet. Um, Meat-heavy dishes, which contain saturated fats, may have other stuff in them we don't want. Okay, processed meats, for example, right? Bacon, right? Bacon is completely cool in the ketogenic diet. You can have like look at it. I mean, you can have bacon. Bacon is not good for you. Processed meats are linked to cancer and diabetes, likely due to the sodium nitrite. You can get bacon without it in there, okay? Just like you can get ham without the sodium nitrate in there, but you are probably not getting that. Most of it does. Most of it has it in there. Also, red meat is linked to colorectal cancer. Okay, that is a fact, right? So if you're eating steak and bacon every day, the saturated fat is not my concern. That's not my concern. I'm not concerned about the saturated fat. I'm concerned about the processed meat, the sodium nitrite, which is a processing, right? Processed meats are still processed foods. If you're trying to eat healthy, but you're like doing the ketogenic diet, why are you eating processed meats? And that's like breakfast sausage. Look on the pack. That's not ground meat. There's sugar. I mean, you're probably not eating breakfast sausage because it has sugar in it if you're doing ketogenic. But maybe you didn't realize that, and you thought that it didn't have sugar in it, but it does. A lot of sausages, salamis, ham. It's got this junk in it. Okay, and then red meat in general can be a problem. So that's why I advocate for like chicken breast, turkey breast, like duck breast. I mean, things like that. These are the healthier, pork loin, things like that. Like if you're going to eat meat, these leaner, non-red meats are your better options. And then just fish. Fish is a meat. fish in general. If you're staying away from your high mercury content fish like swordfish, marlin, um, things like that, you're going to be better off. All right. So that's a that's not to say the ketogenic diet is bad. It's just saying that it's another thing that makes it harder to do that diet and be healthy at the same time. You can do it. It just becomes it's very restrictive and very challenging. So you have to walk this line if you're going to go that route. All right. Which I think, could be a good route as long as you can do it right. I think it's easier to eat a variety of foods that are just unprocessed. Like if you just have a rule of I'm not going to eat processed foods, and I'm not going to eat things with added sugar and junk like that. You just have so many more options on the table for yourself, and it just makes more sense to me. This is a diet that cultures all around the world that we've been eating unprocessed foods since the beginning of time in every culture on earth. Some eat more vegetables, some eat more meats. I mean, you look at like Siberia, they're mainly living off meat up there because they can't grow anything. And then you look at places um, South Asia, where they're, India, Pakistan, Nepal, where they do eat meat, but it's a very bean and vegetable and, rice heavy cuisine, spices, very healthy cuisine. There's, there's a ton of ways to do it right. All right. Next, fermented dairy, such as cheese, yogurt, and kefir, may be higher in saturated fats. However, they confer benefits to the microbiome. So here's another one like, oh, I have to limit this because of the saturated fats. No, we're not worried about saturated fats. Don't worry about saturated fats, right? And like, whereas I try to limit meat and red meat and processed meats and things like that, I do have my fair of dairy, my fair share of dairy. I love a good cheese. I trust a lot of European imported cheeses. I really trust those. America makes some great cheese, but you have to be a little bit more careful with the cheese from America. Yogurts, kefirs, those sorts of things. The yogurt, make sure there's no added sugar in there. The kefir, I get the unflavored ones. So very good stuff. And then eggs. Um, Eggs, people think that eggs are bad because of the cholesterol. They don't even have that much saturated fat. I think people may assume eggs have saturated fat. They don't. All right. So there's my spiel on saturated fat. Hopefully I've convinced you that saturated fats are not the enemy, but foods that contain them may have other things to be concerned about. So we can't just go hog wild on this stuff. No pun intended. All right. So next, let's get into, so we talked about saturated fats. Now let's talk about the unsaturated fats. I'm not going to talk about the monounsaturated. Those are awesome. Those are my favorites. Olive oil is just so good in so many ways. Like if you ever look at the way people in the Mediterranean actually cook, the, the food is like sitting in a pool of olive oil, and these people are healthy, right? Olive oil is like magic. It is like avocado oil is also in there. I just like avocado oil, to me just doesn't have any flavor, but it's also one of those kind of fats, healthier fat. But olive oil it just has so many brilliant things in it. We don't even know what all it has in it. Just all these tiny little phytonutrients. It has properties where it prevents, absorption of calories in the gut, so that like you don't even take in as much. I have olive oil every day. I have a squirt bottle of olive oil, and like sometimes when I just feel, I'm walking by my pantry, I just open up my squirt bottle and just squirt some in my mouth. You know, Brian Johnson, the big, guy who wants to live forever, I think he does a shot of olive oil every day, and like a lot of people think that that's crazy, and then how could I have a shot of olive oil? And I'm like, how could you not? It's delicious. All right, so let's move on to the last ones, the PUFAs, the polyunsaturated fatty acids. Okay, so these are critical for brain structure. We can use omega 3s, we can use omega 6s. A lot of people are against these omega 6s, and that's what we're going to talk about in part 2 of this episode. All right, folks think that these omega 6s may cause health problems because of um, becoming oxidized or rancid when subjected to heat, oxygen, and moisture. That's true. That can happen. So, like, they're not as shelf stable. Like, you don't want to have them sitting around forever. You don't want to heat them too much. And so you do have to be careful about that. And that applies to both omega-3s and 6s. Um, that can happen during the processing of these oils, and you could get free radicals that can get stuck in there. So that can be a concern. Um, and the triglyceride is a storage for fatty acids. As processing and heating may damage polyunsaturated fats, and excessive energy is stored as saturated fat. But remember, we're not really concerned about saturated fat. So here's a big one: is that omega-6s become pro-inflammatory mediators, and omega-3s are anti-inflammatory. I don't need to sell you on omega-3s. Omega-3s are like the greatest thing on earth. Like, they're even better than olive oil, right? Omega-3s are the king oil, all right, or the king fat. Oils are just liquid fats. Um, Omega-3s, they're the boss. We've talked about that on a whole episode, but let's dive deeper into omega-6s. Are they pro-inflammatory? Yes. Is inflammation bad for your health? Yes. So are we going to make the same mistake? So the same folks that are like pro-saturated fat, they're like anti-seed oil, anti-omega-6s, right? But aren't we making the same jump here? Omega-6s increase inflammation. Inflammation is bad for health. Therefore, omega-6s are bad for health. Like, kind of how we said, saturated fats raise LDL, and LDL increases heart risk. Therefore, the saturated fats raise heart disease, but they do not. Okay, so inflammation is bad for health. However, the impact of omega-6s in the diet is very debatable. So it's not clear that even though they can be pro-inflammatory, that they lead to poor health. All right, and we're going to dig deeper on this. All right, um, so let's talk about inflammation just for a second. This is an article: Inflammation, Depression Fans the Flames and Feasts on the Heat. This is 2015 from the American Journal of Psychiatry. And these were the main points from this article. Inflammation and depression have a bidirectional relationship. Stressors, pathogens, childhood adversity, obesity, pain, disturbed sleep, poor diet, sedentary lifestyle can contribute to inflammation and ultimately mood. All right. And this is what we're talking about: lifestyle medicine, right? Those are all like the lifestyle medicine things, right? And one way through not doing them right is increases in inflammation. All right. Depression, childhood adversity, stressors, and diet can influence the gut microbiome and promote intestinal permeability, leading to inflammation. And we talked about the leaky gut stuff, I think, the last episode, right? And then inflammation can lead to negative mental and physical health consequences. All right. So inflammation is a problem. Okay. And here's a study that's often cited. It's this Greenland Eskimo research, fatty acid composition and thrombocyte phospholipids study. And I just want to bring it up because I want to tell you that you shouldn't listen to this. All right. So they basically looked at the difference between like arachidonic acid, which is an omega-6, EPA, which is an omega-3, an omega-6-3 ratio, and cardiovascular mortality between the US, Japan, and Greenland. The Greenlanders they're living in the tundra, right? So, or I don't know if it's tundra in Greenland, but it's frozen. They're not growing anything. They're subsisting off of seal blubber, right? So when you looked at this ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, which we're kind of thinking that like two, I don't know, 2 to 3 is a good ratio. Wait, four to 1 is the ratio we want. 4 to 1 omega-6 to omega-3 is the kind of goal ratio. And in the US, it's 50 to 1. And this study is 1970s. So this probably gotten worse. So in the US, it was 50 to 1. In Japan, it was 12 to 1 because, they have a much more fish in their diet. And in Greenland, it was 1 to 1, right? Because of their seal blubber diet. Okay. And then what they showed was cardiovascular mortality was 45% in the US, 12% in Japan, and 7% in Greenland. They were like, look, this is the reason why. But I mean, this is just a correlation study. Okay. And what happened was the conclusions of this 1970 study were actually shown to be deeply flawed by a study from 2014. Maybe I'll do a separate episode on that at some point, but you can look it up. This this is just not valid. And so a lot of people will cite this study for kind of demonizing omega-6 fatty acids, and it's not a valid thing to do. It's just not a, it's just the study is flawed. All right. So let's talk about fatty acids and mental health. So there's mounting evidence linking omega-3 deficiency or an unbalanced omega-6 to 3 ratio in humans to depression, aggression, violence, bipolar disorder, ADHD, and cognitive decline. Now, that doesn't say that seed oils are bad. That doesn't say that omega-6s are bad. It just says that, like, the ratio, that means if you're not getting like any omega-3s and you're getting almost all of your stuff from omega-6s, that might be a problem. And that's why I advocated for omega-3s. But I'm not saying to eliminate omega-6s, right? Those are still okay. We just don't want to not have the omega-3s in there, right? So that doesn't just, don't take that like the omega-6s are bad. It just means that like only omega-6s might be a problem. Like the lack of omega-3s may be a problem. All right. And I went through this omega-3 stuff on that other lecture, but I just want to run through it quickly. DHA and EPA omega-3 is made by the algae, right? Farm fish may not have as much, but it still has quite a bit. The ALA kind of omega-3s are found in nuts, seeds, grass, insects, and livestock that eat those foods, right? And then the livestock can convert some ALA to DHA and EPA. So if you've got pasture-raised, grass-fed meats and eggs, you may get some DHA and EPA, but it's mostly ALA. But ALA is still a good thing. But it kind of goes, EPA is the best, DHA is next, and ALA is good, but compared to those others, not as good. All right. So omega-3s contribute to chronic disease reduction. It's cardioprotective, lowers blood pressure, decreases triglycerides and LDL, increases HDL, decreases risk of arrhythmias and thrombosis, improves endothelial function. Endothelial is the lining of your blood vessels. Improves colorectal cancer risk. It's neuroprotective for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, neurodegenerative diseases, decreased risk of preterm birth and low birth weight. It's helpful in head trauma. If you've had head trauma or cerebral edema, it's protected. If you have a diet high in omega-3s, it's protective against those conditions. And fish oil supplements may help with those with known cardiovascular disease. However, it may be worse for those that do not, and consumptions of oily fish is safe for everyone and may confer benefit. I generally would advocate for eating the whole fish because, when we do isolated things, it's kind of like how we test, like, are we testing saturated fat in isolation, or are we testing it in its whole food form, right? If we're just testing it in like, this is food that has high in saturated fat, how do we know the problem is coming from the saturated fat versus something else that's in there, right? You can't just take the fish oil. It's probably not that beneficial. You should probably eat the whole fish. All right. But I mean, this is new information. When I talked about omega-3s before, I was talking about how they help with depression, but here we show how it helps the heart, colorectal cancer, neuroprotective, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, head trauma. It's good for lots of stuff. Omega-3s are the king, right? And so I've got this chart here that shows like it helps with cardiovascular health, improved mood, attention, mood, concentration, joint health, pregnancy, breastfeeding, bowel health, respiratory health. And they recommend combined EPA DHA products. And depending on which of these things you're trying to help, it's got different doses. So they kind of range between 600 to 4,000 milligrams a day of a combined EPA DHA. For the mental health stuff, it was 1,000 milligrams. All right. But for some of the other stuff, it was upwards of 4,000 milligrams. There's no upper limit of omega-3s that you can't take. So it would be impossible to overdose on omega-3s. And then this one I did talk about before, meta-analysis on EPA from 2011. EPA is identified as effective treatment component in depression. recommend 60% EPA. Best results are 1,000 to 2,000 milligrams EPA in excess of DHA. We don't want pure EPA. We do want a 2-to-1 ratio. EPA to DHA is recommended. Um, so if you're trying to help mental health, those were the recommendations that I went over before. Um, and then, I talked about how omega sixes can cause inflammation. So let's finish up with kind of omega sixes. I've kind of alluded to the fact that I'm not that afraid of omega sixes. Just like I'm not afraid of saturated fats, I'm not afraid of omega sixes. I don't think omega sixes are the best fat, um, but I don't think that they're harmful, and that's what I want to go into right now. All right. So we talked about this idea that they can be pro-inflammatory and that inflammation is bad, right? So let's dig deep on that, right? Let's talk about and to do that, let's talk about seed oils, right? And this is in the news a lot lately. Oh, seed oils are bad, and we need to get rid of seed oils and artificial colors, and you know, I've already talked about, like, I think artificial colors could probably go, but they are like really low. Like, I think you're getting very tiny benefit from that, whereas there's other things that like the ultra processed foods we should get rid of, like fructose, high fructose corn syrup, which would convey a lot more benefit. Processed grains, things like that, a lot more benefit. I think artificial colors are just like an easy thing to get rid of, and it's like, oh look, political gain, political win. We got rid of something that like is barely harmful compared to a lot of other stuff because like it was super easy to get rid of because we don't need it, right? Um, Seed oils, they're most of them are high in omega 6. If you heat them too high, it can increase trans fats, which is bad. However, despite the hype that seed oils are dangerous, the vast majority of studies suggest the opposite. All right. Diets with seed oils, and they've done studies, diets with seed oils versus saturated fats have better outcomes. And remember, I don't hate on saturated fats, but when we look at studies where when they replace foods that are high in saturated fats with foods that are high in omega 6s, the omega 6 group wins out. All right. So once again, this kind of goes back to, it may not be the saturated fats that are the problem. It may be the foods that they're in that contain other things that are the problem. But at the same time, like there's plenty of foods that are high in saturated fats that are not a problem. Okay. But the seed oils beat out the foods with saturated fats in almost every study that I could find, right? Omega 6 consumption actually improves all cause mortality, lowers LDL, and decreases cardiovascular disease. Um, Much of the evidence against it comes from an old study that included a lot of trans fat. All right. Remember, trans fat is um, it is a type of unsaturated fat, and a lot of the foods that like margarine, for example, is got a lot of it has a lot of omega 6 in it because I mean, it's soybean oil essentially. I mean, that's what that is. You're taking soybean oil and or some sort of vegetable oil, and you're hydrogenating it, and you are creating a lot of trans fat. And now we don't have trans fat anymore. But a lot of these studies in the past, when they were looking at our omega 6 as a problem, those foods contain trans fats, right? Which are really bad for us, like super bad. They're like, out of all the fats, that's the one you eliminate. And luckily, in the US, we've eliminated it finally. Um, the other fats are not really a problem in and of themselves. The fats, maybe some of the foods that are contain those fats, but the fats themselves, not the problem. The trans fat, that's the really bad one. All right. So a lot of those studies that demonized omega 6s actually also had high trans fats, which kind of confounds those results. All right. So seed oil, if problematic, is actually the last processed food you should consider eliminating. It is almost certainly better than saturated fats. So it's actually probably better than saturated fats. And whereas, you know, it may not be as good as some other fats, like if you're trying to be super super healthy, I would not view seed oil as poison. I would view olive oil as better. I would view avocado oil as better. I would view fish, fat from fish, which you're not going to cook with, obviously, but like if you're looking at replacing fats, omega 3s, I would look at that as better. I would just, I gave you my list of kind of like ranked fats, and I said, it's omega 3 is the top, and then monounsaturated, and then it's what is it? Probably omega 6 is probably next, and then saturated, and then the medium chains, and then trans fats at the bottom. And pretty much the medium chains you probably want to not overdo, but they're not terrible. Like I would not go overboard on coconut oil. I know a lot of people are like all in the coconut oil thing, but I would probably be careful with that. Like you don't want to do too much of that. Um, but I would just try and eat the fats at the top, the omega 3s, the monounsaturated, and honestly, probably the saturated omega 6s are not, they're kind of in the middle, but they're not bad. All right. But like if you want to be super healthy, do the ones at the top of the list. All right. Another thing, butter and lard, which obviously are saturated fats, um, in small quantities for cooking are less problematic than if you top them. Like if you're like smearing butter on toast. And the main problem there is like you just don't, I mean, you don't want to eat that much of this stuff because it's high in calories, right? If you're cooking with it, you're using like much lower amounts. But when you're like drizzling it on top of stuff, you're just adding a ton of calories. Okay. And that would be the main problem. The saturated fat component's not my concern. It's like all those extra calories that you're consuming. All right. Here's another point about seed oils. Cold pressed seed oils, and like you've got the cold press of olive oil is popular, right? That's like the really good stuff. First press, cold press. You're not using the heat. There's a lot of heat and things used to on these seed oils. So this cold press seed oils, which are not necessarily that easy to find, they do cost a lot more. They're slightly better because they contain healthy components that are removed in refined seed oils, but the benefit's still unclear. And the regular seed oils, that doesn't mean that they're bad. So that the refined seed oils are not necessarily dangerous. It's just that the cold pressed seed oils um, are a little bit better and still inconclusive. But if you have the money and you want to, I would recommend those. All right. So, but not a necessity. The main problem with seed oil, okay, you've been waiting, like I've been all in on seed oil. You got to hear I got to give the counterpoint. What's the downside to seed oils? And there's a huge downside to them that I have not mentioned yet, and it is their inclusion in unhealthy ultra processed foods. It's not the oil itself, it's not the omega 6 itself, it's the fact that it's in the ultra processed foods, right? The main place you're finding these is there. Like when I cook, I don't use seed oils. I mean, when I go out to eat, are they using seed oils to cook my food? Probably. I don't know what they're using. But when I cook at home, I use olive oil. Sometimes I'll use butter. Um, but I don't even have seed oil in my house. But at the same time, I'm not like against it, and I'm sure I'm eating it when I eat out. But the main problem is like look at all those processed food, look at the boxes, look at the crackers and the chips and all that. Those have seed oils in them. So it's not necessarily the seed oil that's the problem, it's their inclusion in these unhealthy foods. And it's all the starches and simple carbs that are like in those foods. And you're adding extra fat that you don't need. That's the other point. It's not necessarily that the seed oil is the problem, it's the fact that they're high in calories. And when you're like combining them with sugar and starch and like making some sort of snack item out of them, or even like some processed food that you're actually eating as a meal that's got this packed in there, things like mayonnaise. Mayonnaise is basically all seed oil, right? I mean, I think you can get the olive oil kind. You can make your own. I've made mine. I always use olive oil. Um, it gives a little bit more of a neutral taste if you use like vegetable oil. So I'm like not against doing that. But I mean, the fact is, there's a lot of calories here, and it's just like it's just getting added on. Okay, so I don't think that there's necessarily the health detriment to the seed oil, the omega-6 itself. My concern would be that when they're added to other foods, it's kind of like putting butter on your toast. You're just putting a bunch more calories on there, and that's going to lead to weight gain, and weight gain is going to lead to um, all these metabolic problems that we're talking about on this series. Okay, so if you have some vegetable oil and that's what you use to cook your meal at home, there's no issue with that. You probably don't want to heat it too high. You don't want to like heat the oil up before you cook and leave it heating and it smokes and then still use it. Don't do that, right? You don't want to have it on your shelf for years. It can take on some baddies can get in there. Um, it's just not as shelf stable. But if it's fresh and you're not heating it too high and you're cooking with it, there's no issue with this. Okay, but we're using it in these unhealthy foods, right? And it's increasing the calorie content, and it's being used in too large of a volume. All right, so that's where I have the problem with the seed oils, is their inclusion in the ultra processed foods. All right, um, some individuals may be genetically sensitive to high intake of omega 6s. I want to point that out. So there are some folks out there that actually don't do well with omega 6s. It's not most people. And so this is where we talk about the individual thing. You got somebody out there saying, these are actually bad for me. And why aren't you talking about this? And it's like, not for most people. All right. But there are some people that may be sensitive to this. And if that's you and you, that then, and you kind of find that when you have them, things in your body, you're just not as healthy, then avoid them. No big deal. Just avoid them. We have lots of other options. All right. Not but the fact is, not everyone can afford olive oil and avocado oil and nut oil. So the nut oils like walnut oil and things like that, those are also really good. But those are all expensive. Those are our best options, but not everyone can buy them. And if everyone did buy them, they'd cost even more than they did now, and we'd run out of the supply. So without seed oils, um, we wouldn't be able to feed our country. Um, I remember I was listening to this thing about hunters and like how I said that like hunting animals. I think this is a good way to get your meat. But like if everyone hunted for their meat, there would be none left, right? So we have to factory farm stuff. Um, it's just in order to feed everyone. But that's why I advocate for eating more plants so we can avoid this factory farming. All right. So there's your evidence. There's my opinion. There really isn't any good evidence that seed oils are a problem. The main issue is when they're combined with trans fats, old studies that were not done properly, um, maybe some individuals that are sensitive to them skewing results. Um, the fact that they tend to be found in ultra processed foods. So if you're doing a study where like, oh, this is someone who's on a high seed oil diet, but like they're eating nothing but Doritos, and it's like it's not it's like it's not the seed oil, it's the Doritos, it's the other crap in there, it's the carbs, right? It's the simple carbs, and it's the excessive amounts of oil that's in there. It's not the seed oil itself. So a lot of time in these studies, they'll just say a diet high in this or a diet high in that. It's not like they're feeding people a teaspoon of vegetable oil and then seeing what happens. It doesn't get down to that level. And so there's so much that can obscure the results. All right. But if you are inclined to limit your omega 6s, um, or you're curious to know what is highest in omega 6 and omega 3, I'm going to tell you. All right, I'm going to go through all the oils and we're going to talk about kind of the differences between them. Okay, so what is the highest omega 6 content oil? Safflower. It's a safflower oil. Next, 75%. Next, sunflower, 65%. Next, corn at 54%. Cottonseed at 50%. You're thinking, man, we're eating cotton seeds? Yes, you are. You are eating cotton seeds if you're eating vegetable oil, and you probably are. Has anyone heard of Crisco? What do you think Crisco stands for? It actually stands for crystallized cottonseed oil. So they actually don't use cottonseed oil in Crisco anymore. I don't know why, but it is used in other things. Crisco is another one of those things. It was supposed to be like a lard substitute. It had a lot of trans fats in it. It's kind of like margarine is to butter as Crisco is to lard, but now, they have a way of getting pretty much all the trans fats out of there, and they don't use the cottonseed oil anymore. But that doesn't mean it's not in other stuff. But that also doesn't mean that it's not, just as edible as any other oil either. Sesame, 42%. Peanut is on the lower end at 32%. So peanut oil is actually one of the lowest omega-6 content. Um, it's not really a seed, it's a legume. Soybeans, 51%. Canola, right? Canola oil, 20%. So if you're thinking, oh man, I can't have my canola oil. In canola oil, like when you go to the store and you're looking for oil, the the two main ones that you're gonna well the few main ones you're gonna see vegetable oil, which is mostly made out of soybean oil. Sometimes it's got cottonseed oil in there, but the vegetable oil is mainly soybean oil. And then you see your canola oil, and you may be thinking, what is canola oil, right? It's kind of an interesting story. I'll tell you really quick. It comes from the canola flour. It's otherwise known as the rape seed flour or the rape flour, and I think people just didn't like this name, but it comes from the name actually comes from it's like a rapa something. Uh, it's a type of plant. It's related to cabbage, and like the Latin name for like the plant cabbages is like rapa something or other, and so that's where it came from. It doesn't actually mean like the bad violent type of rape, but it just sounds like that. So they actually canola is actually brand name, and it comes from Canadian oil. That's what canola stands for. There's a lot of canola in the province, what do they call them? The prairie provinces. So you're like Manitoba, Saskatchewan, um, Alberta, a little bit of Alberta, and before you get to the mountains, and then like Ontario, like that area in the center, the part of the Canada that's on top of like Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota. That's where all that is. And in the United States, it's in North Dakota. That's like the biggest place that we grow it. So canola comes from Canadian oil, but it's really the rapeseed flour. But the good news about it is it's only 20% omega-6. If you really care about omega-6, it has like the least amount in it. So, and that's like 50% of the oil at the store. So you really don't need to worry that much about it. Most of your processed foods are using vegetable oil, which is soybean oil, which is higher in omega-6. So if you and there actually is a little bit of omega-3 ALA in canola, whereas there is in soybean too, 9 versus 7%. So canola is your lowest. Peanut would be next at 32. Walnut, despite the fact that it's a seed oil, is still 52% omega-6. Flax seeds 14%, but very high in omega-3, 57%. Um, and so those are your main seed oils. You're going to see, but you're really going to see 3, 4 of those on average. You'll see vegetable, you'll see canola, um, you might see corn, you'll see peanut, and you may see sunflower or safflower. Sometimes those are there. And then sesame is usually in the Asian section in tiny bottles and often toasted or like with hot oil. So but in like Chinese cooking, they do cook with sesame a lot. So if you are trying to keep it low, but like not completely eliminate it, canola may be your guy. All right. So um, those are the main oils that have omega-6 in them. And then you look at olive oil, which is 20% saturated, 75% MUFAs, and 6%. So only 6% of PUFAs, which is your omega-6s. So there's still some in there. Like I said, your rapeseed's 10% saturated, 66% MUFA, and 23% PUFA or omega-6, right? and then peanut would be less. Even lard contains 6% contains 9% omega threes, so it's in everything. You can't avoid it, right? Like people that are freaking out about it, um, and look, there's barely any more in the lard than there is in the peanut and the rapeseed oil. To be honest with you, it's not a huge difference. So stop being afraid of the seed oils. It's not that big of a deal. Um, and so, you know, I'll leave you with that. You've heard my opinion. I'm not afraid of fats unless it's trans fat. Um, and hopefully that clears some things up, maybe made you think. You enjoyed learning about fats, and maybe you feel better about some of the things that maybe you wanted to eat and you're avoiding it. And like, honestly, what often happens is they'll come out with statements of, this is really, really bad for you. And then what happens is, um, instead of eating fat, people start eating sugar or carbs. And guess what? Those are the actual problems. And so it has consequences. Um, but there are a lot of good carbs out there. I don't say all. It's the simple carbs. Those are the ones that you want to limit. All right. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed learning about fats and love the show. And please rate it and review it. It really helps me. And I will see you next time.